My name's Jeff Smith, and I'm an energy consultant at DETA. Energy is something we all rely on for our warm houses, the food in our supermarkets and fridges, our vehicles, but the nuances of the industry mean how it's made, how it gets to us, and how it's consumed are not well understood by many of us. Right now, our energy system's in a bit of strife. We haven't got enough gas right now to meet our needs as a country, which means that gas prices are going up. And due to gas producing lots of electricity in the country, electricity prices are also increasing. And at the same time, we're trying really hard to decarbonise our grid, which means our electricity demand is increasing too. Look, at DETA, we don't have all the answers, but we've started this interview series to seek them from people who do. Hopefully the conversations we'll have through this interview series will give you a better understanding of New Zealand's energy past, present and future, and the challenges we'll need to address to meet our zero carbon future. The first interview here is with the CEO of the New Zealand Gas Company, Andrew Knight, who knows gas better than most.
Thanks for that, Jeff. So Andrew Knight, I'm the CEO at the Gas Industry Company. So we were established through a legislation that was introduced last time we went through one of these supply crunches back in the early 2000s. And we were created as the industry co-regulator. So we are owned by the industry, where we are providing advice to both the government and to the industry on how to try and work through various issues and challenges. And then we have another role of facilitating industry and process.
And Andrew, you're also an old-time player in the gas industry. You've been in the gas industry for a long time, haven't you?
Well, the gas and electricity. So my background, just quickly, I've been here about 6 years. Prior to that, I was the CEO of New Zealand Oil and Gas.
No, thanks. And yeah, clearly you're an expert in this space, so great to have you here. Can we talk about the gas market? And I guess if there are people on the listening to this, they don't really know where New Zealand's gas comes from. I guess a couple of questions. One is maybe can you give us an overview of where that does come from and what that looks like? And yeah, I guess what's changed over the last sort of 50 odd years of that gas industry being in place?
We've gone from, and there's some information on the Gas Industry Co website, so I can point people there. But just quickly, first discovery in New Zealand was onshore in Taranaki, the Kapuni field. That was a discovery that then prompted the development of a gas industry in New Zealand. And at the time, gas was a fuel that was starting to be utilised overseas as well, so it was still reasonably new. And then the Maui discovery in the 70s, which was a very significant field. So it was globally significant when that field was discovered.
It was very, very large, wasn't it? Really big. It
was very large. One of the top, I think it was in the top 5 in the world at the time. And it created an opportunity for the government at the time to assess how we wanted our energy future to play out. New Zealand, prior to that, had been looking at all sorts of options around nuclear or embracing coal more significantly. All these options got overwhelmed by the opportunity that Maui presented. So the Maui development came on stream, provided a very low-cost energy for New Zealand for roughly 30 years. And it enabled the development of things like the gas-to-gasoline plant, which was put in place during one of the big projects during the energy crisis of the 80s, 90s. And it got up and running. That got overwhelmed then by other activities, the urea plant that we now see, which is now balanced. So a number of activities come off the back of it, CNG, and those sorts of things were initiatives about enabling New Zealand's energy independence, because at the time, global energy markets were challenging and energy independence was a key theme. Fonterra built a lot of its activities off the back of cheap energy that came from cheap electricity and cheap gas. And we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that field in the development. Maui started to get into its decline phase in the early 2000s, and we were in a phase where it needed more investment. The gas price was too cheap. to then reinvest in the field and start to see the next wave of New Zealand energy come to market. Gas, we went through a process in the early 2000s that led to a significant increase in the wholesale gas price from roughly a couple of bucks to around $6. So a tripling of the gas price. That then enabled the industry to reinvest and recapitalise itself. And we saw the development of a multiple of a number of prospects that have been sitting waiting for Maui to decline because it had been so dominant. So the Pohokura field, the Kupe field, and importantly the Makimanga, Heiwa and Turangi fields onshore, all were developed to then provide multiple sources of gas for the new market. We've lived in that world now for about 20 years. And then in 2017, we had the exploration ban. And that put a freeze on new developments, particularly offshore in New Zealand, because those permits needed significant pieces of capital to come into them. The industry needs, and the number's always been roughly 300 to 500 million about every 3 years or so, to just keep the gas flowing. That sort of investment, we've had some investment during the last 6 years, and that investment had been committed really prior to the 2018 exploration ban. That's kept us going for quite some time, and a significant portion of the gas we produce today comes from investments during the last 5 or 8 years. But that there is a long lag time, and we've started to see a slowdown in that investment, particularly in some of the fields. The fields are maturing. These are old. It's old technology, right? It's like my 1968 Ford Escort that I could fix myself as an accountant, not an engineer. That's the technology we're using here at Kapuni, which is 1960s, 1970s technology. And so these plants need to be nursed and they need to be managed through. The newer fields in the 2000s are much newer technology, but we still need an ongoing investment cycle to keep the gas flowing. So we're going through another phase at the moment where we've had a decline in production. Can the industry recapitalise itself? Are the stimulants there to recapitalise, reinvest, and drive the industry forward to its next phase? And that, whatever that next phase is. And how does the industry mature past this current challenge? What are the needs and demands? We produced a report at the request of the last government back in 2019 called the Gas Market Settings Review, and we looked at what are the challenges for the sector moving forward, and are the market settings appropriate for the transition that is going to be required? And we concluded that they weren't. Two key areas. One was the lack of investment confidence and the ability for the industry to reinvest. And two, the lack of any structured certainty and long-term certainty around the relationship between gas supply and electricity generation and the needs of electricity, the changing needs of electricity.
So,
there were a number of other issues, but those were the top two. Roger, question?
I was going to say, so of the gas that we're using today in New Zealand, what percentage is coming onshore and what percentage is offshore?
We're still dominated by Maui is still producing a significant amount of gas. I think today's number was somewhere around 70 terajoules a day out of a total of around a little under 300. And then Kupe is producing about 45. The plant there can and used to produce 77. Pohokura, which is also offshore, is producing around about 70. So we have a number of, though that's the offshore stuff. So probably roughly half is coming still from the offshore fields. And a lot of the new stuff that's come on stream in the last year or two has come from the offshore fields.
Okay, and you made a point earlier on around the investment required to keep these fields going, $300 to $500 million per 3 years, I think you said.
Yeah.
What's actually been spent over the last 6? So 2017 was the point where it was announced for the offshore exploration ban. I mean, clearly, I envisage that investment hasn't been sufficient over the last 6 years.
No, I think it arguably it has been in some respects,
Okay.
and the investment has been well in excess of $500 million over the last 5 years. The bulk of that has gone into the offshore fields. So the older, more mature assets where you're doing infill drilling rather than new drilling. And those infill drilling programs are naturally going to produce lower production rates than the initial wells that went into those fields. So you're getting to the end of life development of these fields. But there has been quite a significant investment, particularly from OMV. And then the first couple of years, 2018, 2019, there was still quite a bit of investment from the onshore guys. But that's all stuff that had been programmed prior to the ban.
Yeah.
With the ban coming in, particularly onshore, we've started to see that production come down. There's a couple of wells being drilled at the moment. One is an infill well into Pohokura, so an offshore development, and there's some other wells going in onshore, but they are much smaller and the program is much smaller. So the question is, can the industry recapitalise enough to get itself enough cash flow to maintain at the levels we were previously? Do we want to be at 500 TJ a day where we were previously, or are we more comfortable at 300 TJ a day now? How long is that sustainable, and will the industry keep investing? And that's part of the challenge that I think the current government is trying to work through.
That's a question. You talked about the 50-year Maui program, and I think, look, I guess maybe I'm a younger person on the line, but I wasn't around at that time when that investment was made, but you and Roger, perhaps you were. Why did we choose at that time not to export? Because part of, I guess, the challenge and opportunity at the time was, well, you talked about getting the country to a point of energy security, and that was really, really important, and we went down that track. But that meant that we've, I guess, isolated ourselves from the international market to a certain degree, which has meant we've got potentially lower prices in the short term, but now maybe less ability to access gas from other places. Have you got any perspective on that?
So, Jeff, the key driver at the time was about energy security.
Okay.
Because in the 70s we were in a very different world. I'm sure Roger can as well. I can remember having nuclear war drills where we all went at school, where we all had to go through, and we would dive under our desks because there was a nuclear bomb coming. I don't quite know what it was going to do to save us, but
there's a long time. Yeah.
It was a very different world, and energy insecurity was a key theme. The world had come through a pretty challenging time in the early 70s, where petrol prices or oil prices leapt, and the development of OPEC and a number of other issues. So actually energy security was such a key theme. And the gas to gasoline plant was taking natural gas, turning it into petrol so that we could start to isolate ourselves from that key inflationary issue of our exposure to international oil prices. You won't remember Carless days where we had a day a week we had to nominate that we weren't allowed to use our car. And if you were caught on the road with the car on your Carless day, you got fined. And that was all about energy security. So it was a very different world in that context. Interestingly, what we did do during that time was create our largest exporter of energy from energy. So we created, as part of the gas to gasoline plant you created a methanol plant that has now created a significant export industry, and we've enjoyed for the last 15 years healthy export revenue from Methanex.
Sorry, Roger.
Of the gas we use today, how much is used by Methanex?
So Methanex are using, and we publish these numbers, so they are available on our website. Methanex, I think in the last week or two, have been roughly sitting around about 80 TJ a day. So out of a market of a little under 300.
So they're using about just about under a quarter of our energy, and then electricity is about another. What's that breakdown of where that gas is using?
Electricity is very seasonal, of course.
Yep.
And the electricity industry at the moment is relatively constrained. That's where we're seeing one of the constraint points. So a thermal unit, a E3P, will use roughly 60 terajoules a day if it's running flat out. The Rankins can get to more than that.
Yeah.
But they aren't able to run it anywhere near those levels at the moment because they don't have the gas contracted to use.
So with the squeeze we've got on at the moment, who's using less gas? Methanol, the methanol people are using less, and the
So
electricity people, who's making the biggest contribution there, Andrew?
Methanex have made the biggest contribution by a long, long way. So Methanex ideally would be running at about 200 TJ a day. Or even if they had their other plant that they mothballed a few years ago, they'd be running at 250 TJ a day, and they're down at 80. So it's quite a significant decline that they've absorbed.
You talked a lot earlier on around the ability for the industry to invest, raise the capital, invest in itself. One of the things I was going to talk to you about was the fact that gas is a transition fuel, and there's this perception or perspective that at some point in the future we're not going to use gas. And 2050 is thrown around as the time to do that, which is in 25 years. The fields we've had have kind of been about a 20-year field life. Do you think it could be challenging to attract that investment because of the perception of whatever a zero net carbon 2050 looks like?
Yeah, it's interesting. The numbers that the Climate Commission produced to get to the net zero 2050 still had roughly, in their two scenarios, the lowest one had 35 petajoules of gas still being used in 2050. So, which is actually quite a lot of gas. And they had it being used predominantly in their modelling and electricity peaking to support the development of renewable electricity. I noticed the recent reports from MB came out a few days ago. They still had quite a bit of gas being used out in 2050, predominantly for the same purpose, but also high process heat and other uses. So no one has actually produced a report that had zero gas being used in 2050. And the reason was that they were trying to manage the other parts of the trilemma, security of supply and price, particularly to consumers. And that's the part that hasn't been able to be solved. So what role does gas play is actually probably your question. Our solution that we put forward in that gas market settings paper I talked about was actually the advantage of a gas transition plan would have provided some of the give the industry some comfort as to what it is investing against, and the industry will invest to that. If you don't tell people what they're to invest against, what your expectations are, it becomes much more challenging.
Yes.
So Andrew,
you go, Roger. Go, Roger. That's fine. Sorry.
So Andrew, what the tightening of the gas market we've seen over the last few months, what's caused that?
So that is the natural decline of field. So this isn't unexpected. In fact, arguably it was government policy that we had a decline. The timing of the decline is perhaps slightly unexpected. So we produced a report, which is also on our website, where we did a demand supply scenarios, and we got EY to do that. That report had the gap opening up between supply and demand in 2025. And we forecast that there'd be quite a gap starting to open up from about 2026 without significant new investment. What's happened is partly because of a couple of wells that haven't gone as well as might have been expected under a P50 scenario. Those wells means that time frame, the outcome hasn't changed, but it's just come forward slightly, and only slightly, only really by about a year or so. So this is expected. It's just the timing that was questionable.
So the explanation is we were drilling some wells to keep existing gas fields going, and those wells have not produced the gas that was predicted.
Not the wells predicted, but you've got to remember it's a P50 scenario. So it was a 50-50 as to whether they were going to do it anyway. Sure. And I think part of what people get mixed up with is when you build a plant, when you build a wind turbine, you've got a pretty good idea of how much it's going to produce before you stick it up.
Yeah.
And with the oil and gas sector, you've got a reasonable idea, but the more you're doing infill drilling and the more that you are stepping the field out to its less certain boundaries, the more that the P50 scenario is a genuine P50, and you're going to have some that don't work.
Yeah, and so what you said earlier on is, well, pretty much all of our fields are at that point, right, where they're at.
Yeah, we're reasonably late life on most of them. There'll be some reserves data coming out in the not too distant future. MB publish a compilation of data that they receive from the industry around this time most years. And that will give us an indication as to what people, a year ago, what people thought they were going to be getting out about now, and for the next 18 months. Yeah, there are some opportunities. There is some development that could still occur. So it just needs capital to invest in the right conditions to bring that gas to market. So I think there is, whilst there's a bit of doom and gloom, investment can solve at least part of the problem.
And you talked earlier on about the fact that there's the larger prospects still exist, and I imagine from reading between the lines here, those prospects are still offshore prospects, and the government's currently going to go through a process to allow exploration to occur or extraction to occur at those prospects. Is that right?
Well, they'll allow exploration, but exploration is a long time horizon. So
how long is long before that comes online?
So best case scenario, you'd be looking at 10 years. And normally and when I was in my NZOG role, we spent a lot of time trying to attract and working with international partners, potentially to come into some of these prospects. What they need to see is a runway of prospects. You don't come in for one prospect, you come in for a runway of multiple opportunities, and you want to see that you can get that runway to work. But the time horizons are long, and we'll need to deal with it's very mobile capital. So we're competing against other parts of the world for that capital.
And that's interesting, other parts of the world, because I guess look, we work across Australia as well, and a couple of years ago Australia had a bit of a challenge from a gas perspective because of the issues that occurred up in Europe through the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Europe was therefore not going to purchase gas from Russia and looked elsewhere, and that spiked prices in places like Australia. So other parts of the world are still looking to do lots of this, and as you say, that competition piece might limit not only access to equipment and people and expertise, but also capital.
Yes, it does. And there's some, Australia's got some really interesting challenges. In some respects, it's mirroring the challenge we've got. Yeah. They've had exploration or development bans put in place by some of the state governments. There are significant quantities of gas available in parts of Australia that won't be developed because of social and community issues in the regions where those gas fields are, or where that gas could be developed. And as a result, they've become increasingly dependent on a smaller number of regions, and they're in an international market where they're competing. You're competing for the domestic supply. If you put domestic reservation, which they have done, there are some people that argue the domestic reservation makes it worse because you put a price cap on domestic reservation. You therefore lower the incentive for developers to develop to that market.
So how much are gas prices up at the moment with the squeeze we've had on? How much more am I paying for? If I went up for market now, how much more am I paying than I'll be paying a year ago?
So your residential price has risen a bit, but it hasn't risen that far, Roger. If I look at a wholesale level, if you go back to 2017, price was roughly low to mid $6. That's now low to mid $9. And that's over what, 5-6 years.
But we're seeing spot prices of gas. If I was buying gas today at the spot market, what would I be paying today on that, Andrew?
The spot price. So the spot market is interesting. So the spot market is about 4%. As we get smaller, it's probably more 5-6% of the total overall market. So the bulk of gas is sold under long-term contracts because people need the certainty of revenue to make the investment, and you've got that ongoing investment cycle. So the spot gas is a mix of some people who've chosen to go uncontracted because they thought they could get it cheaper. You've had some people who contract in a base load and they then buy on spot. And a significant part of the spot market is people who where their customers took more gas than they put in for a variety of reasons, and therefore they've ended up short the market, if you like. They sold more than they purchased. That gas gets resolved by the transmission company buying that gas off the market and making those parties whole and charging them for that. So naturally, the gas spot market should be, and it generally is, the most expensive gas that you can get.
And what we are seeing is lots of the customers we work with, sort of, not the large industrials have Methanex and balance, but certainly that mid-tier process, I guess, backbone of New Zealand economy customer are seeing some of those spot price rates coming through to some of the agreements that they're seeing, and so they're being exposed to that.
So we've been concerned about that for a while, and certainly in our correspondence that we've been pushing out, some of it goes just to the industry, some of it goes to those industrials. Where industrials they're not large enough to have an energy manager. Sometimes they're getting a bit caught out and surprised, and they didn't recontract early enough. They're now in the market where they're contracting it at the moment, and they then get caught by hydrology. Hydrology in the electricity sector means that the electricity guys are trying to soak up every gigajoule they can get. And if you're in the market right now trying to contract, it is quite tough, and you are going to see increased prices. Last time we saw this happen, about 4 years ago, it worked its way through quite quickly. This time I think it's going to take a little bit longer, but we do think it'll work its way through.
And that'll work its way through by more investment in the fields to have more supply coming online, and therefore.
And there are other things happening. And I can't talk too much about the gas security response group that the government set up, because that's obviously a government thing that we are involved in. But the industry has come together and they're looking at a range of options, and we're cautiously optimistic around that. But the industry keeps working on it. And no doubt when the government feels it's appropriate, they'll come to market with something around that. But I'd urge people to, if you've got a gas contract that's expiring sometime in the next 12 months, get out early, start to try and recontract it and think about how you go about that.
So what sort of, if I'm one of those customers getting out there, what sort of gas price would I expect to see for a 5-year gas price at the moment, Andrew?
We don't. I'm reluctant to put a gas price out and get hung on that, Roger, not because I'm reluctant to get hung, but I'm just reluctant to sort of try and lead people one way or the other. But it has gone up at the moment. There's no doubt about that. Just as electricity prices have risen to up over $300, gas prices have also risen.
I guess the difference with the electricity prices, I can see an ASX price, a futures price, where that price is coming down. But I don't see that same thing in the gas industry. I don't see a gas price coming down in any market that's kind of publicly discussed, notified.
So there is a futures market in gas, but it doesn't have the liquidity, because you don't have a significant number of the industrial customers in particular sitting in that market, giving it a bit of liquidity as you do in electricity. Yes, it is tougher, but we have seen wholesale prices come down and commercial industrial prices come down in the past. MB published some data recently, which showed a little spike back in 2021 that's then wound its way through and then come off. We're seeing as another part of that cycle at the moment.
So what does that futures price? What is that? What are those futures contracts for those of us? What are those futures contracts trading at the moment for 3 or 4 years out?
I think there just hasn't been enough liquidity for it to be an accurate guide, Roger. And that is part of the issue, is with the lack of liquidity in that futures market.
So is that liquidity a lack of buyers or a lack of sellers?
No, I think there have been people who were selling into it, but it's been a lack of buyers as well as a lack of sellers. And therefore, neither side really puts the effort in to try and make the market work. And there's no market maker making it work.
Okay.
The natural user for that would really be electricity. So you've got the electricity market that should then flow through into gas futures market. The electricity guys haven't been inclined to engage in that space. They go directly to the producer to try and lock down gas for longer term contracts.
Yeah. Can I ask about those bigger guys though? So we talked about the investment piece, and my understanding from reading Business Desk, because that's as deep as my knowledge goes in some of these things, is seeing that the likes of OMV and Beach Energy are looking to divest of their New Zealand assets.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see others that will step into that space and create the investment required for the market?
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that, and there are companies that around the world who specialise in coming into end of life assets.
Yep.
So, there are opportunities for those players to come in. There would need to be some work done, and I think, it's going to be an effort to sell the New Zealand dream.
Yeah.
To those companies, and we are seeing capital challenges, and it isn't just a New Zealand issue. You're also seeing the same thing in Australia. The banks and the superannuation funds and some of those traditional sources of capital have committed to quite aggressive decarbonisation targets for their own corporate goals, and that then flows through into the capital market. So you're starting to see companies both in Australia with Australian activities and in New Zealand start to explore other capital markets and look to things like the US markets and so that may be where we need to get to source capital from.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm almost as old as you, I think, and I remember my old, I was once involved in a company that did, offshore oil and gas stuff, and you always have the dream. If you found some big field, you'd go and turn it into gas for electricity generation. And it seems to me that opportunity is much less than it was because renewables have got cheaper. We've got a carbon charge now. So if you found a lot of gas, your option of selling that gas to electricity generation seems to be much less than it was. And it means to me, just exploration, just in general, looks less attractive than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
But on the flip side, Roger, the cost of exporting that gas is either an LNG or a methanol. If you had a big discovery through a floating production facility, is much cheaper. So we now, 20 years ago, it was an LNG market in its relative infancy. It was developing still. Now you've got countries who are completely dependent for their gas on LNG, and that market has matured through 2 or 3 phases now. So, and the technology has matured significantly. Even in the last 10 years, the cost of both regasifying and shipping for transport of LNG has changed dramatically. So I don't think that's an issue. I think if we had a large discovery, we had a prospect that we were quite attracted to offshore Canterbury. If that was a discovery, you might bring a bit to shore to help and decarbonise, get rid of the coal out of some of those dairy factories and the like. But the bulk of it would be exported offshore as either methanol or as LNG.
Yeah, I certainly see, and this is, I guess, a broader energy conversation, perhaps not for this podcast, but more around, look, we have an issue in New Zealand, not only around electricity generation, which I guess we have a pathway for generation, there's consented supply, but we have a storage challenge. And that's where the previous government quite liked Lake Onslow, which was interesting and could help solve that issue. But the reality is the key reason why gas remains long-term is gas is a cheaper solution for I'm going to call it the top 2%. We can get 98% quite comfortably, but the top 2% becomes challenging. And I suppose the economics go both ways, right?
Yeah, and MB produced report said, their best scenario, I think, got to 98. Their sort of mean scenario goes about 95% renewable. Electricity is a really poor customer for gas because it's the volatility of the load, right? You build a gas plant, you just want to turn it on and run it. And electricity is a really challenging customer. So it is always going to be lower down in the priority stack, particularly in our system. The solutions here should involve storage or other opportunities for demand to be managed to meet our unique generation requirements, and particularly starting to address winter risk and those sorts of things. And there's lots of opportunities to do that, and there's lots of opportunity to get that balance right, but it does need the industry to come together to work through that.
Can we segue slightly and talk about the 2050 future? And there's talk of alternative gases floating about. And so, the two that come to mind are biogas and hydrogen. Can we talk about biogas initially? I know you've been part of a report which was done in 2019 that Fonterra supported. The volumes of biogas certainly are smaller than the amount that we need in the market today. But do you see an opportunity or a future where biogas could meet that future 2050 need?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with my view on how you get to net zero is everybody's got to do everything all at once to try and contribute, right? So does biogas or biomethane have a role to play in that? Absolutely. Why wouldn't it? Particularly as some of it you can do pretty cheaply. We produce quite a lot of biogas in New Zealand, and the different biogases to biomethane is essentially how it's been cleaned. So biogas has a number of different chemicals and things in it. You take it through a process and you can create biomethane, or even various renewable LPG type products, propanes and other products. So we don't use that in New Zealand. Other countries make much better use of their waste to create bioproducts. So why wouldn't you do it? Would be my first port of call. And there hasn't been a driver to do it. In fact, the ETS arguably disincentivises people to do it. The other factor here is, can you get it to market in a way that targets particular market niches? So arguably decarbonising our residential sector, the most expensive way to do that is ban actually residential gas. You put all the cost onto the electricity sector, and you put all of that peak load onto the electricity sector. Using the gas pipe, the existing infrastructure as a battery, as the equivalent of a battery, because you can store a lot of energy in a pipe and then draw down on it during that peak period, unlike electricity where it has to be instantaneous, unless you're using batteries. So the gas pipes acts as a battery. And if you can put biogas into that gas pipe, you get a battery that is a decarbonised battery supplying heating and cooking and hot water. So that seems to be a logical solution. So to put that in context, the entire residential gas market is around about 4 petajoules of gas. Residentials and small commercials, depending on where you measure it, where you cut it off, can get up to 6 or 8. We currently produce, because we don't actually measure it properly, but we think we currently produce around about 5 petajoules of biogas. So more than enough for the entire residential market.
When you say we produce, or it's available, it's not currently injected into the gas system, is it?
No, most of it is flared. So it is currently predominantly flared. If it isn't flared, it is burnt in pretty inefficient electricity generation units.
So that 5 PJs, is that North and South Island, Andrew?
That's North and South Island.
So of that you'd also have the issues of getting that gas to market as well.
Yes, the untapped. So there was a report that Powerco produced earlier this year. They'd identified about 9.5 petajoules in the North Island and about 9.1 petajoules in the South Island. So it is quite a significant quantity. That 4.9 is what we currently produce across both islands. And so ignore the South Island stuff. Let's keep burning it into inefficient gas units. Let's stop flaring it. That might be a start. Or you could turn it into a bio LPG. So if you can start using the biosources in a much more sensible way, you can actually start to run this through a decarbonisation program quite easily. We did some numbers analysing what would it cost if you blended 20% of the natural gas in the North Island with a bioproduct at $20 a gigajoule. So lifting from current wholesale prices of around about 10 to around about 20. And you're looking at an increase of around about 10% for a residential gas customer, which is relatively immaterial in the scheme of what else is happening in the energy system. So, we think it's quite feasible, but currently it's not really incentivized. So, there are. If you're running a waste treatment plant in Auckland, for instance, you're producing a lot of biomethane. Currently, they're incentivized to burn that on site because they then avoid some of their scope 2 emissions, scope 1 emissions. If they put it in a pipe, it gets included in their scope 2 and 3 emissions, and they have to pay ETS on it, and they run into all sorts of issues. So these issues need to be resolved. If you look at other countries, particularly in Europe, they're producing a lot of biomethane, and they use it quite sensibly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting reflecting on what Europe does have. Excuse me, where I believe it's Denmark, and they produce somewhere around about 19 PJs and have potential to go to 38, which would be pretty much their entire future gas demand. So I think it can be done in those circumstances. But as you say, you need the right incentive, and they have been doing it for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And they have the industry there.
They have the industry there. Well, I mean, we don't necessarily even need incentives. What we need is to get rid of the disincentives.
So are people investing at the moment in this?
Right. So both PowerCo and First Gas and EcoGas, that's free. But PowerCo and First Gas are both looking at projects. So PowerCo have announced a couple where they're looking at waste treatment plants. First Gas have announced that they're looking at some, and they facilitated EcoGas's renewable gas coming to, which is a waste to methane, taking food waste predominantly to methane project, which is getting injected into the system just above Taupo. And that gas has all been purchased and I understand sold. So, that's small things happening at the moment, Roger. One of our industrials in New Zealand used to have the largest biogas facility in the southern hemisphere. That got shut down 5-10 years ago because it wasn't deemed to be within their strategy and economic at the time, and that's where the government policy was at.
Can I really quickly on hydrogen? People are talking about hydrogen as being potentially part of the future. I mean, I know it has roles, right? So I'm not saying that it's certainly not got a role to play, but mass market?
We did a report on this also on our website. Keep do that plug. Yep. We looked out to 2035. We didn't see a role for it out to 2035. And the reason was not a significant. There are niche applications where it can work. And the real reason there was that we hadn't seen that there would be enough excess electricity built to provide the hydrogen cheap enough to then go into mass market applications. Back at the back end of the 2040s, 50s, possibly. We didn't look out that far deliberately because we were given a 2035 horizon, but it's challenging to see that you would take electricity, turn it into hydrogen to use instead of electricity.
Yeah,
that's now, unless your hydrogen solution is taking the off-peak electricity, and it provides a solution for taking off-peak electricity and then putting it into a storable form.
Yeah, so it becomes, it's almost the same, I guess, conversation we had earlier on about, the Lake Onslow replacement. I mean, overbuilding renewables and using hydrogen as a battery is probably, something worth considering. But you'd have to overbuild renewables in order for that to become economic. And then, as you say, why not just use the electricity?
Yeah. Having said that, building up our demand for electricity so that you prompt that overbuild, if you like, from our current demand, and building up that overbuild into either e-methanol or hydrogen is not a silly strategy for then stimulating the development in the offshore wind. Yeah.
And so talking strategy though, because this is one of the things where you've talked about it earlier on, we need better direction from government. We still don't have an energy strategy, and here we are in mid 2024, waiting for this document to come out. Is there a wait and see pattern from industry, or are we moving ahead, waiting for surely we need better coordination and direction here.
Yeah, so I'll give my personal view on this. I think as a country, we've fallen a little bit into a hole where we wait for other people to tell us what to do, rather than businesses being prepared to assess and understand risk and then understand how they invest against that. We had a number of initiatives around renewable gases, carbon capture and storage, some of those sorts of things that needed to occur that we'd identified in our draft transition plan that we presented to the incoming ministers as part of our briefing. And that's also on our website. Those initiatives are being followed by the government. So, they are doing those things. Those things seem to be progressing, which is great. And where they land, that's something the government and the cabinet will need to work their way through. But the general direction, I'd like to see New Zealand businesses trying to assess risk and move forward rather than trying to wait for someone to tell them what to do. Because when you wait and for people to tell you what to do, you're also expecting a subsidy. And I think New Zealand's not in that space. We can't be, because we don't have sufficient capital.
We can't afford it, and we're better off deploying capital to more productive means rather than incentivising the right decision. Yeah,
absolutely. So that's my view on an energy strategy. I don't think it's and the energy strategy. We could probably dream up 90% of it over a few beers on a Friday night. We've already committed to getting rid of coal. You've got to work out how you get the transport fleet off liquid fuels and onto something else that is a decarbonised version of that. That's not going to happen in one go. It happens in stages. The energy sector, the rest of the energy sector, electricity needs to invest. We need to invest in our transformation, not ban stuff. And that's probably your energy strategy.
I appreciate your frank feedback there, and I'd echo those thoughts. It certainly is, in some ways it's a hurry up and wait, but I do see some sectors moving quite quickly. I think it's interesting, right? If I reflect on the electricity sector, and we've talked about this a little bit in our own office over the last few while, the Tiwai deal, which was done 3-4 weeks ago, has certainly helped stimulate conversations there. There was too much waiting and seeing, so that can only be helpful for investment, not only in the electricity sector, but I'd also say in the gas sector, which provides a little bit more certainty on what full electricity demand might look like.
There's no doubt that has helped provide some certainty as to how that part of the sector is going to move forward.
I guess the last question, Andrew, is what should our listeners be watching out for over the next few months to give them reassurance that the gas industry is going to almost calm down, and we're going to see prices come back? Is there some announcement or some event that's should give them more confidence?
I think, and it may not be that this will take a little while. It's around investment. Let's see some drilling. We get some stuff happening. We'll start to see some of the heat come out of some of the contracts that need gas. And the industry has worked through these issues before in a constructive way. 2021 was similar in some respects. 2018 was similar in some respects. 2003, 4, 5, absolutely the same. So these issues have been worked through before. They'll be worked through this time. I have absolute confidence that the industry recognises that it needs to work through these challenges.
So the thing we're looking out for is really just successful wells being drilled and producing gas.
Yeah, and people, that's your ideal outcome. The other thing is the contracting market, where people are starting to get gas and contracts are starting to be signed.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew.
Perfect. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insights. yeah, look forward to continuing the conversation with you around and solving these problems.
Great.
So,
Thanks for the opportunity.
awesome.